Hello everyone. There seem to be many questions about the DuPont equation, what it is for, whether it is redundant and things like that. So I'm going to have a brief discussion about the DuPont equation and what it is used for. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start talking about the DuPont equation and what it enables us to do. So the whole idea is, after having looked at all of the different ratios that you have looked at, it would be very useful to see how they work together to determine the return on equity. Now, the return on equity is basically is what is of interest to the equity holders or the shareholders. They are interested in the rate of return that they will get for their investment in a corporation, and hence ROE is one of the most important rates of return that analysts and equity holders look at. So the DuPont equation, which was developed in the 1920s by the staff at the DuPont Corporation, and hence the name, enables us to do that. And basically what the DuPont equation is a calculation of the ROE by breaking it down into three components: the profit margin, the total asset turnover, and the equity multiplier. And these three things essentially give us an insight into what areas the firm is strong in or weak in, what areas it can do improve the return on equity. So as you know, the ROE is calculated as net income divided by the total common equity, which we then break down as, if you follow the bullet points on the slide, as net income by sales multiplied by sales and divided by the total common equity. So the first term, if you notice, net income by sales, is nothing but how we calculate the profit margin. Then we break down the term in the second bracket, which is the sales by total common equity, as sales by total assets and multiplied by the total assets divided by the total common equity. So the second term, as you might recognize, is nothing but the total asset turnover ratio, and the third term is nothing but the equity multiplier. I have a brief discussion about the equity multiplier at the end of this video, so I suggest you take a listen to that as well. So let's discuss the DuPont equation and its applications using a specific example. I'm just going to use some hypothetical numbers for a corporation, and then we'll discuss what is happening. So let's look at a firm with some information that I have provided you with. Revisiting the return on equity in the form of the DuPont equation again is ROE is calculated as the profit margin times the total asset turnover times the equity multiplier. And let's say we have some numbers available to us along with the industry averages, and we have a net income of 117.5. Whether the number is in thousands or millions, it doesn't matter. The sales are 3,000. The total assets are 2,000, and the total common equity is 940. So if you plug in these numbers and calculate the profit margin, it comes out to 3.92%. The total asset turnover comes to 1.5 times, and the equity multiplier comes to 2.13 times, which when multiplied together gives you a return on equity of 12.52%. Now let's assume that the industry in which this firm operates has some average ratios that we have information available for, and let's assume that the profit margin industry average is 5%, the total asset turnover is 1.8 times, and the equity multiplier is 1.6 times, and the average industry return on equity is 15.03%. So you can look at the ROE, and obviously you see that the return on equity for this particular firm is below industry average. And now the question comes as to why is it below industry average and what can we do to improve it. So let's look at the first term, the profit margin. The profit margin tells us essentially how much the firm earns on its sales. And if you think about it for a minute, it's calculated as net income divided by sales. So it primarily depends on the costs that we have and the sales price. So if you think for a minute that if a firm can command a premium price for its product and in addition to that hold down its costs, its profit margin is going to increase. An increase in the profit margin according to the DuPont equation will lead to essentially an increase in the return on equity, which is what we are interested in. The second term is the total asset turnover, and it is basically a multiplier that tells us how many times the profit margin is earned every year. Now, when we said that the profit margin was 3.92%, it basically means that the corporation earns 3.92% on each dollar of sales. Now, if you combine that with the asset turnover ratio, we see that its assets were turned over 1.5 times per year. So its return on assets is 3.92% profit margin times the number of times you turn its assets over or into 1.5, which comes to 5.9%. Now keep in mind that 5.9% is nothing but the return on assets. So it's the return on its total assets, but the way we have calculated this, we have already paid off the debt holders. When you calculate the net income, if you remember, we subtract the interest charges from the EBIT and then we subtract the taxes to get our net income. So we have already paid off the debt holders, and whatever return, this 5.9% that we just calculated, 5.9% is calculated as 3.92 times 1.5. It belongs to the common stockholders. Now, since we basically need to adjust this because the 5.9% is a return on assets, so we need to basically adjust it up, since the equity multiplier is 2.13 times, to calculate the actual return to the equity holders, because the assets, if you remember, are provided both by the equity holders as well as the debt holders. But since the debt holders have already been paid off, we want to see what the rate of return is for the equity holders. So we multiply this 5.9% by the equity multiplier, which is 2.13 times in this case, to get a return on equity of 12.52%. Think of the equity multiplier as the adjustment factor, which basically tells you of a firm's assets, how much are financed through debt, how much through equity, and hence its importance in determining the return on equity. There's a little bit more discussion about this at the end of the slide, end of this video. Now, whether you calculate the return on equity using the DuPont equation or just by using net income by total common equity, the answer you get should be the same. So you might ask, what is the point of going through all of these steps required to implement the DuPont equation to find the return on equity? And the answer is that the DuPont equation helps us to see why why the corporation's return on equity is only 12.5% versus the 15% or 15.03% for the industry that it operates in. You can look at the numbers and see that its profit margin is below average, 3.92% versus 5% for the industry average, and this indicates, or this could indicate, that its costs are not being controlled as well as they can be. It can also indicate that it cannot charge premium prices for its products because there could be a potential problem in the product and the quality, or whatever the case is. The point is that the profit margin being below industry averages enables us to identify that this is a potential problem area. You need to delve into why it is a problem area by asking questions like, are our costs too much, or are we not charging enough price? Are we not charging premiums for our products? If so, why not? Is there a quality problem? And so on and so forth. You can also see that since the equity multiplier is higher, it uses more debt than more companies, and because it uses more debt, it obviously has to pay higher interest charges, and that could also be reducing its profit margin, although this effect is not probably as large as the effects of the cost and the sales price. The total asset turnover ratio, as you can see, is also below industry average, 1.5 times versus 1.8 times for the industry, which indicates that it has more assets than it needs, or in other words, it is not using its existing assets as efficiently as the average efficiency in the industry it is in. So it might want to do something about improving its utilization of its assets and increase the efficiency of its assets. And finally, since the equity multiplier is high, it basically means that it has much higher debt compared to the industry average. You can see the equity multiplier of 2.13 versus 1.67 for the industry average. And again, I refer you to the end of this slide, which will help you gain a better understanding of why a higher equity multiplier means higher debt. It's Keep in mind that although we said that higher interest charges might decline the profit margin, since it's a multiplier, it can also offset the lower profit margin to some extent. But essentially, higher equity multiplier means higher debt, and higher debt basically means that there is a higher risk of bankruptcy. And the reason this is so is the corporation has to make interest payments on the debt, and if it cannot, then the debtors can essentially force the corporation into bankruptcy. So having a high equity multiplier, although potentially increases the return on equity, it also increases the risk that a company might not make enough revenue to be able to pay its debt holders, and hence face a risk of going into bankruptcy. So it might want to cut back on the financial leverage that it has. Financial leverage meaning the amount of debt that it has. Now let's say let's just say hypothetically that it reduces its debt to the industry average of 1.67%, and you can see we'll just assume it restructures it has a restructuring, and it brings its equity multiplier to 1.67, which is the industry average. You'll see the effect it has on the ROE on the second bullet point there, which says new leverage ROE at 3.92 times 1.5 times 1.67, which gives 9.8%, which is even less than what it was before. So because it is taking on much more risk, at least its return on equity was 12.5%. So just lowering its amount of debt is not going to solve the problem. It does indeed need to look at why its profit margin is lower and why its total asset turnover is lower than industry averages. So management could potentially use the DuPont equation to help identify ways to improve its performance. So let's focus on the profit margin for a minute, and potential solutions could be having marketing people study the effects of raising sales prices, or study the effects of introducing new products with higher margins. Accountants can study various expense items and work with purchasing agents or engineers or other operating personnel and look for ways to cut costs. So we are trying to increase sales and cut costs, which will improve the profit margins. You can also look at ways, maybe have the credit manager look at ways to speed up collections, which would reduce the accounts receivable and improve the total asset turnover ratio. These are just examples of what steps management could take after identifying where the problem is. You can ask the finance staff to analyze the effects of alternate debt policies, essentially looking at how changing the structure, reducing the debt would affect the ROE, and in combination, what are the steps that management can take to improve the return on equity for this particular firm and bring it on par with industry averages. So you could expect management to basically undertake a series of moves by identifying what problem areas are using the DuPont equation to calculate the return on equity. So I hope this answers a lot of the questions you guys have been posting on the Muddy Points discussion forum. If you have any more questions, let me know and we can discuss some more. This slide just summarizes the DuPont equation again, and the three components that go into the calculation of the DuPont equation. It's the return on equity is calculated as a product of the profit margin times the total asset turnover and the equity multiplier. The profit margin is a measure of the firm's operating efficiency, or in other words, how well it does to control costs and also how well it is generating sales. The total asset turnover is a measure of the firm's asset use efficiency, or how well does it manage its assets, whether it's using its machines efficiently, uh, so on and so forth. And the equity multiplier is a measure of the firm's financial leverage, which tells you essentially how much debt and how much equity has gone into the capital or the assets that the firm has. Before I discuss the DuPont equation, I wanted to say a few words about the equity multiplier, because there seem to be a few questions about what exactly it is, and why is the equity multiplier equal to the debt to equity ratio plus 1, which is a formula used in your book. So if you remember the definition of the equity multiplier, it is defined as the ratio of a company's total assets to its stockholder equity. And the equity multiplier is a measure of how much debt the firm has as compared to equity. Now, if you remember, the word equity implies ownership. So essentially, it's giving you an idea of, given the total assets of a firm, how much of it is financed through equity and how much of it is financed through debt. Now, if you think about the total assets of the firm, or if you think about a balance sheet, on the left hand side we have assets, and on the right hand side we have liabilities and equity. So you want to think of the balance sheet in this way, which I have found makes thinking about these things easier. A firm essentially buys all its assets and it raises money from somewhere to buy these assets. Now, where that somewhere is either through issuance of debt, or borrowing money from whether it's a bank, or by issuing bonds, or any other source of debt, or through equity, let's say from shareholders who have invested money in the company in return for an ownership stake in the company. Now, all the money that is raised is either through debt or through equity of some form. So the company then takes all this money and then it buys stuff with it, and the stuff that it buys is what we call the assets of the firm. So in a sense, the capital raised through debt and equity should be equal to the value of the total assets of the firm, because all the assets are purchased either using equity from equity holders or debt from debt holders. So that being said, then the total assets of the firm are equal to the debt plus equity. Now, by definition of the equity multiplier, we define it as the total assets divided by the equity, and therefore, since the total assets are equal to the debt plus equity, the equity multiplier is debt plus equity divided by equity, which we can then calculate to be equal to the debt to equity ratio plus 1, and this is the formula used in the book. There were a few questions about why equity multiplier is a measure of risk, and the reason for that is, if a corporation has a lot of debt, it will have a high equity multiplier. That should be obvious from looking at the formula, because a company which has high debt, or a corporation which has high debt, is going to have a lower amount of equity in if you look at the ratio between the debt and equity. So what happens is, as a company takes on more and more debt, its equity multiplier increases. Now, you might turn around and say, why is taking more debt risky? And the answer to that question is, example I like to give students is, suppose you have a roommate who is asking you to borrow, let's say, $50, and whatever reason he or she wants it for. And the question I ask students is, will you give your roommate $50? And most students say, sure, I'll give $50. So the next question I ask is, what if 5 days later the roommate comes and says, I want to borrow another $50? Will you give your roommate $50? And half of the students end up saying that I might not, half of the students end up saying I might. Then I ask them if he or she comes 5 days later and asks for another $50. And by then, essentially, everybody is hesitant to loan money. And the reason for that is, on an individual level, you're not sure whether that person is going to return the money to you or not, and what that person is doing with that money, and and you start viewing your roommate as a risky investment. So essentially what happens in the corporation is, as it takes on more and more debt, it has to make interest payments every period, let's say every month or every quarter or whatever the agreement is with the debt holders. And as the amount of debt becomes larger, it has to have a certain amount of revenue to be able to service that debt. Now, debt holders essentially, if they don't get paid, can bankrupt the firm. And if the economy takes a bad turn, or there is some other issue with the firm losing revenue, then it can end up in a position where it's not making enough revenue to be able to pay debt holders, and hence the increased risk. All right, so let's move on to the DuPont equation.